When no one is there for you, something precise occurs inside the psyche. The familiar supports fall away, not dramatically, but quietly, and the individual discovers that movement must now come from within or not at all. What feels like abandonment is often the first moment life stops negotiating on your behalf. There is no audience, no reassurance, no corrective voice. Only the fact of your own continuation remains. This moment is not cruel. It is exact. Most people misread this condition as personal failure. They assume that support has vanished because they are unworthy of it, or that effort has gone unnoticed. Yet isolation of this kind tends to arrive at a very specific threshold, when reliance on approval has begun to obstruct maturation. As long as external validation is available, the psyche delays the formation of inner authority. Growth is postponed in exchange for comfort. When that exchange becomes too costly, support withdraws, not as punishment, but as correction. This is why so many lives stagnate in competence without direction, activity without consequence, effort without advancement. The correction never comes. In my own clinical observations, later articulated in what I would call individuation, I noticed that isolation appears most forcefully when a person has outgrown the structures that once sustained them. Friends no longer understand the direction of movement. Mentors fall silent. Even encouragement begins to feel hollow. This is not because the path is wrong, but because it has become singular. The psyche does not mature collectively. It matures individually, and often against the grain of its surroundings. Solitude is the signal that dependence has reached its limit. The early danger lies in resisting this signal. Many attempt to regain support through compromise, self-reduction, or resentment. They seek to be seen again, even if it means abandoning the necessity that first separated them. This produces a peculiar fatigue, a tightness in the chest, a mechanical repetition of tasks that no longer carry meaning. Movement continues, but momentum disappears. When isolation is avoided rather than entered, life contracts, quietly, irreversibly. The withdrawal of support also reveals something previously hidden, the extent to which energy was bound up in projection. Approval was not merely pleasant, it was organizing. Motivation, discipline, even self-respect were outsourced. When no one is there, these borrowed structures collapse. What emerges initially is guilt, then loneliness, and often resentment without object. The body registers this withdrawal as heaviness or restlessness. Yet if responsibility is not reassigned outward again, something unexpected occurs. Energy returns. Here the psyche makes a decisive demand. Either the individual becomes their own witness, or advancement halts. Without observers, people-pleasing loses its function. Borrowed motivation expires. The inner dialogue changes tone. There is less encouragement, more insistence. Less imagination, more execution. Carl Jung once remarked that the most important questions are not those that can be answered, but those that must be lived. In isolation, this becomes unavoidable. You do the work because it must be done. Nothing else remains. This is the emergence of inner authority. And it is not comforting. It is sober, disciplined, and exacting. The individual learns to validate effort without applause, to correct course without humiliation, to persist without hope as incentive. Short declarations begin to replace elaborate justification. This is necessary. Progress without witnesses requires compression, clarity. Self-trust becomes behavioral, not emotional. You move, you stop, you adjust, you continue. When advancement no longer depends on recognition, life reorganizes around quiet competence. There is less urgency to explain, less need to convince. Movement becomes sustained rather than dramatic. Solitude stops feeling empty and begins to feel protected. Carl Jung understood this as the natural outcome of individuation, the psyche aligned with its own law rather than the expectations of the many. What advances in this way does not rush, does not announce itself, and does not retreat. It proceeds. This is not a choice. It is a law. Advancement begins when support withdraws and responsibility is retained. When support disappears, what remains exposed is not merely solitude, but the structure that depended upon others to function. Habits that once felt natural begin to feel hollow. Effort produces irritation instead of satisfaction. The absence of witnesses reveals how much inner movement was regulated by response. This realization arrives quietly, often as a dull pressure behind the eyes or a heaviness in the limbs. It is not despair, it is the first accurate measurement of dependency. At this stage, guilt emerges with particular force. Not the guilt of having done wrong, but the guilt of having withdrawn. The individual feels as though an unspoken contract has been violated. Expectations that were mistaken for conscience begin to protest. One feels selfish without having acted selfishly, disloyal without having betrayed. The psyche reacts as if survival itself were threatened, because for a long time survival was organized around belonging. The body reflects this confusion through restlessness, shallow breathing, or chronic fatigue without clear cause. Loneliness follows, but it is not the loneliness of lacking people. It is the loneliness of no longer receiving orientation from outside. Former sources of direction fall silent. Advice no longer arrives. Encouragement feels intrusive rather than helpful. This is the point at which resentment often appears, directed vaguely toward others, for not understanding, not supporting, not remaining. Yet this resentment masks a more exact truth. The psyche has withdrawn its projections, and the individual has not yet reclaimed them. In my own work, later systematized in the psychology of individuation, I observed that dependency persists only as long as projection remains unchallenged. When approval, guidance, or validation is projected outward, energy follows it. The individual feels animated when seen and depleted when unseen. Once projection collapses, energy initially disappears. This is misinterpreted as weakness. In reality, it is redistribution. What was dispersed must return before it can be used. The cost of dependency becomes visible only here. Progress that relied on praise slows. Discipline that depended on pressure dissolves. Without external friction, movement feels unmotivated. The psyche responds by producing symptoms: irritability, boredom, a sense of being unmoored. These are not obstacles. They are signals that responsibility has not yet been reassigned. Energy cannot move until ownership is accepted. When responsibility is reclaimed, a subtle reversal occurs. The same tasks that once felt draining begin to feel neutral, then stabilizing. There is less emotional fluctuation around effort, less anticipation, less disappointment. Action becomes quieter. The body adjusts first. Breathing deepens. Sleep becomes heavier. The nervous vigilance that sought response begins to settle. Energy does not surge. It consolidates. This consolidation is often mistaken for emotional flatness. Yet it is precisely here that momentum becomes possible. Without the need to be seen, action no longer fragments. Without the need to be affirmed, correction becomes efficient. Carl Jung noted that what we do not make conscious appears to us as fate. In dependency, fate appears as abandonment. In responsibility, the same condition becomes structure. The individual now encounters a new demand: to tolerate progress without emotional reward. This is where many retreat, attempting to reattach projection to others or to future outcomes. But if this demand is endured, something essential forms. Motivation becomes intrinsic. Direction clarifies without explanation. The psyche stops asking whether effort will be recognized and begins asking whether it is necessary. This is the turning point. Energy that once leaked through expectation returns as capacity. Isolation no longer feels punitive. It feels instructional. The absence of allies ceases to be interpreted as loss and begins to function as containment. Movement stabilizes. Advancement resumes, quietly. Energy returns when projection is withdrawn and responsibility is claimed. At a certain point, progress halts, not because effort is insufficient, but because no one is left to confirm that it matters. The individual discovers that encouragement no longer arrives and that explanation no longer satisfies. What remains is a stark demand to continue without being witnessed. This demand exposes a final dependency that often goes unnoticed: the need to be affirmed in order to proceed. Until this is relinquished, movement remains conditional. The collapse of people-pleasing follows naturally. When no response is forthcoming, behavior organized around approval loses coherence. Politeness becomes unnecessary. Justification becomes inefficient. The individual notices a subtle irritation when performing for imagined observers. This irritation is instructive. It reveals how much energy was spent shaping action for reception rather than necessity. The body often responds here with rigidity or emotional flatness, as if refusing further negotiation. Self-validation does not arrive as confidence, it arrives as discipline. One begins to act without commentary, to correct without shame, to persist without optimism. The inner dialogue shortens. Explanations give way to decisions. This compression is not emotional withdrawal, it is psychological efficiency. The psyche no longer asks whether effort will be approved. It asks whether it is accurate. Here, inner authority begins to form, not as belief, but as function. The individual becomes their own witness, recording effort internally rather than seeking reflection. This produces a distinct calm, often mistaken for indifference. In truth, it is alignment. Action and judgment occur within the same structure. There is no delay between assessment and correction. Movement becomes continuous. This stage is often accompanied by a peculiar somatic shift. Breathing becomes steadier. The chest loosens. The compulsive scanning for response diminishes. Tasks feel heavier but clearer. There is less excitement, but more traction. Emotional highs fade. So do collapses. What remains is a consistent capacity to act. This is not inspiring. It is reliable. Carl Jung understood this as the transition from borrowed authority to inner law. When external validation collapses, the psyche must either disintegrate or reorganize. Those who endure this reorganization discover that motivation rooted in self-validation is quieter but inexhaustible. It does not surge, it sustains. At this point, the individual no longer measures progress by recognition. They measure it by precision. Errors are corrected quickly without drama. Success is registered internally without display. The need to announce diminishes. The need to continue strengthens. Life narrows but deepens. This narrowing is essential. It removes distraction. Short declarations now replace internal debate. Do the work. Adjust the method. Continue. There is little narrative attached. The psyche ceases to negotiate with itself. This is the end of persuasion and the beginning of execution. Authority is no longer argued for. It is enacted. Those who retreat here often mistake the loss of emotional reward for loss of meaning. In truth, meaning has shifted location. It no longer arises from being seen, but from being accurate. This accuracy becomes stabilizing. Movement resumes without urgency. Progress becomes cumulative. Inner authority forms when self-validation replaces external confirmation. There comes a stage where advancement continues even though nothing acknowledges it. No response follows effort. No signal confirms direction. The individual moves forward without friction and without reinforcement. This is often misinterpreted as stagnation, yet something precise has occurred. Action has detached from outcome. Movement no longer negotiates with recognition. It proceeds because it must. At this stage, solitude no longer feels provisional. It becomes structural. Days organize themselves around necessity rather than anticipation. The psyche stops asking whether progress will be noticed and begins arranging life so that it can continue uninterrupted. There is less urgency to speak and less interest in being understood. Energy concentrates. Distraction loses appeal. Competence deepens quietly. The absence of witnesses produces a particular clarity. Without observers, there is no incentive to dramatize effort or to exaggerate difficulty. Tasks are met directly. Errors are corrected immediately. Improvement becomes incremental and stable rather than aspirational. The body reflects this shift through steadiness. Movements become economical. Emotional extremes soften. There is less exhaustion because there is less performance. Here advancement acquires a different rhythm. It is slower but uninterrupted. There are no peaks that demand recovery and no collapses that require repair. The individual discovers that progress sustained in obscurity accumulates more reliably than progress fueled by attention. Momentum becomes internal. It does not require renewal. Carl Jung observed that individuation ultimately removes the individual from collective pacing. One no longer advances according to approval cycles or social milestones. Life reorganizes around inner law. This produces a peculiar invisibility. Others may assume nothing is happening. Yet beneath this assumption, structure is forming, capacity is consolidating, direction is stabilizing. In this condition, recognition becomes optional. Praise neither accelerates nor redirects movement. Criticism no longer destabilizes it. The psyche has learned to hold its own continuity. What once felt like isolation now functions as containment. Solitude protects momentum by removing interference. The individual no longer waits to be seen. They continue. This continuation changes the quality of ambition. Goals lose their emotional charge and become operational. Desire simplifies into sequence. What is next replaces what will it bring. There is less appetite for meaning as explanation and more tolerance for meaning as process. The psyche no longer asks for reassurance. It relies on trajectory. Those who reach this stage rarely announce it. There is nothing to announce. Advancement without witnesses does not seek confirmation because it has become inevitable. Life moves forward through repetition, correction, and sustained attention. The absence of recognition no longer registers as loss. It registers as freedom. This is the final correction. Progress no longer depends on being accompanied. It depends on remaining aligned with necessity. When this alignment holds, movement cannot be stopped by neglect or misunderstanding. It will continue until its work is complete. Advancement is sustained only when it no longer depends on recognition